Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the most optimistic climate chat you'll hear this year, at least we hope so, and for a conversation focused on electrification and the need for generational climate action. Over the next hour or so, we're going to hear from Bill McKibben, who just got back from COP26 and the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow, and Saul Griffith, the author of the new book, Electrify. We'll also take some of your questions via the chat function, and I'm tasked with keeping the conversation moving, which will be a lot of fun. But first, some introductions. I'm Ari Matusiak. I'm the CEO of Rewiring America. We're the nation's leading nonprofit dedicated to electrifying everything, without which we won't get to zero emissions ever. We're just about 15 months old as an organization, so we're growing and defining our work still. But we're starting with the nation's 121 million households, which we see as the greatest gap in our national ambition on climate change, or really the greatest opportunity. So we work to provide accurate, accessible, and actionable data, and we're working to do nothing less than start a movement to electrify Americans' lives. There's a reason why I'm wearing a tie, which is not just because of Dr. Griffith and Bill McKibben. It's because we're here in Washington tonight to launch a couple of things. The first is a bicameral electrification caucus that is going to be co-chaired by Senators Heinrich and Smith and Representatives Tonko and Castor to really put forward electrification as a central part of the climate solution and to advance policymaking and education nationally at the policy level on these issues. We're also launching a CEOs for Electrification Coalition with a cross-section of CEOs and companies that represent not just the companies that make the things, but also companies that represent millions of customers around the globe who can help to communicate the need to electrify everything. And the third is a Mayors for Electrification Coalition, which is comprised of a growing number of newly elected and longtime leading mayors across the country who also get that electrification is the answer and what we need to be building toward in the months and years ahead. So now let's get to the speakers. Bill McKibben is the founder of 350.org and thirdact.org, as evidenced by his t-shirt. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, is broadly considered to be the first book on climate change for the global audience. Subsequently, he's published many books and has been published in periodicals such as Rolling Stone to The New Yorker. Foreign Policy named him to their inaugural 100 Most Important Global Thinkers list. Through 350.org, he's established the first global grassroots climate campaign and organized on every continent. Along with thirdact.org, a community of experienced Americans pushing for change that makes the world a better place, he has been at the forefront of the fossil fuel divestment campaign and one of the most crucial players in the climate action movement. Saul Griffith is the co-founder of Rewiring America. He and Alex Lasky teamed up to create our nonprofit to drive a very singular message. And Saul's driving that message right now with a well-reviewed new book, actually well-reviewed by Bill McKibben, called Electrify, an optimist playbook for our clean energy future, which is available at rewiringamerica.org. Saul is an engineer and inventor. As founder and chief scientist at Other Lab, an independent R&D lab, he helps government agencies and Fortune 500 companies understand energy infrastructure and deep decarbonization. He's been a principal investigator and project lead on federally funded research projects for agencies including NASA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, Advanced Research Projects Agency, Energy, National Science Foundation, and the United States Special Operations Command. He is a MacArthur Fellow and was awarded that in 2007. He was also hired by the federal government to map our energy sector down to the last solar panel on the supply side and the last leaf blower on the demand side. And that research led to much of how we see the mandate for how we must electrify our lives, and you'll hear a lot about that today. So with that, welcome. First, Saul, I'd like to start with you. Let's assume for a second that everyone on this webinar has not yet read your book. Could you give us the brief on electrifying everything and why it's a strategy for us to take on climate right now? And also just to assure people that we're not going to electrify any cows.
I wrote the book for a very specific audience, policymakers, particularly leading into this administration and into this COP26. And I wrote it also tried to juggle that with writing it for a general audience. And the reason it titled Electrify was to try to simplify the sometimes confusing conversation about what does decarbonization, what do global climate solutions really look like. Electrification isn't quite everything. There's still agriculture and emissions from some of our chemical industries, and obviously our cows, aforementioned cows, which we won't electrocute. But electrification in the US is about close to 90% of our emissions. I'm sorry, energy is close to 90% of our emissions. Globally, it's about 70%. And it really is only through electrification of all of the things we use energy for today that we can get all of those sectors to zero carbon. And so the book goes through the new ways we have to think about that on the supply side. So where is all that energy going to come from? But very much it's trying to personalize the story on the demand side. So the supply side is where big machines exist, power plants, petrol refineries, etc. The demand side is where humans live. That's our homes, our small businesses. It's our cooktops, it's our motorcycles, it's our furnaces, and it's our hot water heaters. And in some excruciating detail, we even go through all of those machines. And the message electrification, including the policy work that we're doing in DC, is really to try and help people understand that if we focus on the demand side, it's an engaging climate conversation that includes people and offers better, healthier, lower cost, cleaner lives. So getting rid of fossil fuels burning in your kitchen improves your child's respiratory health. Electrifying your vehicle and running it with solar or wind will lower the cost of getting around. And so I think there's optimism in being able to put people back in the picture of climate solutions. And then I look forward to discussion with Bill, which is still, the world is struggling with the exact how to do that. But I think we're making progress.
Thank you, Saul. Bill, I'd like to get your perspective just as a jumping off point on Saul's thesis, particularly in light of COP26. Given the stalemates and insufficient ambition that we too often see, is there a political opportunity in this kind of approach in play?
Well, first of all, Saul, such congratulations on the book. It really is wonderful. And it's not in fact, it's not most engineers who are also capable of writing a readable and lively book. And this is a really wonderful volume. You don't have to believe me, though I did give it a fine review in the New York Review of Books. I noted that a couple of the other people who recommended it, one was Leah Stokes, who's probably maybe the single wisest voice on national energy policy that we have from UCSB. And the other was Kim Stanley Robinson, whose Ministry for the Future is the best book about climate change, that's best novel yet. Stan and I were wandering around Glasgow, wandering around the park outside the University of Glasgow, watching Greta assemble the youth for a big march on the first Friday of the Glasgow talks. And we were deep in conversation about your book much of the time. And it really is testament to
I elected not to go to Glasgow, but if the author of the Mars trilogy and The End of Nature were both there, I really feel like I missed out.
We were having a very good time. So I mean, clearly this is clearly there's no way to do what we need to do without doing this. I mean, at this point, I think it's, if we had some other set of possibilities 30 years ago or something, I don't know what they were, but at this point, we've run out of other alternative paths, it feels like to me. And that's why the book is so hopeful. I mean, look, it's good that we're having an optimistic talk, because there's plenty to be not optimistic about. Not only did Glasgow not go very well, but back in the real world, I mean, yesterday, British Columbia, which 140 days ago had the highest temperatures recorded in Canada since the Pleistocene, yesterday had the biggest rainstorm in their history, and now the city of Vancouver is cut off from the rest of Canada, I mean, we're in a tough place. But and this is the thing I hope you'll talk about for a minute, because it really interests me. Not quite out of nowhere, but sort of unexpectedly, I think, on the rest of the world, over the last decade, this thing has happened, that the price of renewable energy has dropped so sharply that what once seemed both a necessity and a luxury at the same time now seems like a perfectly feasible, if you know, a heavy lift logistically, but no longer exactly a heavy lift technologically or economically. Really. Is that correct, would you say?
I think that is the underlying hypothesis of the book. And I actually agree with you. It does feel a little bit like magic. And I've been on the front line starting energy companies trying to do renewable energy since 2004 when I finished grad school. And it has felt like we've been constantly playing catch up with the incumbents. So, you know, everyone was still trying to bet against solar in 2010 or try different versions than just plain old silicon cells in wafers arrayed. Everyone thought they had ideas, but the scale and the cost reductions achieved from that industry have shocked everyone. And at industrial scale, it's under $1 a watt. It's, you know, which is 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour delivered electricity. On rooftops in Australia, if you know, factoring in the cost of transmission and distribution, rooftop solar is the cheapest electricity in the world, and that could be true everywhere. Batteries, enormous cost reductions. You know, I think even as late as 2018, I think it was hard to imagine electric cars everywhere, but we're really seeing that does look possible now. The cost of batteries are falling faster than even the cost of solar did. I remember starting a wind energy company in 2007. We thought that it would be good enough to get to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. At the time, wind power was 20 cents a kilowatt hour. That project, we did beautiful work and even launched a prototype off Norway in 2019. But by that point, traditional wind energy had got to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So we were beaten by just the brute sheer scale and industrialization of the fundamentals. And that is a large share of where my optimism is that not quite the free market, but the public-private partnerships, which is governments working with companies to do all of this energy R&D and turn it into reality, has been an astounding success.
Is your sense that that we've got plenty of room left to run on that curve too, right? We haven't bottomed out yet on the price of and on the efficiency of stuff.
Yeah, so the way the world thinks about it, or the boffins who study this, is that for every time you double the production capacity, you decrease by what's called the learning rate. And for solar, that's about 20%. In batteries, it's a little more than 20%. Wind, it's a little bit less. But if you took the rate at which we were making solar panels and batteries and wind power in 2020, and you thought about what we need to be doing in 2030 or 2035 to supply the great majority of the world's energy, we need to not just double the production, but double it again and double it 1 or 2 more times. So at those learning rates, it really does look like the price of all of the fundamental ingredients is going to fall by a half or more in that time, and then truly be a sort of slam dunk economically. I think, and to translate into the conversation, because I've been working very heavily the last 18 months with governments in the US, in Europe, and in Australia, which gives me an interesting perspective. The real challenge is that governments don't really know how to write policy that's anticipating that future when the retail experience of their constituents is still that a Tesla is more expensive than a Toyota. It's still the experience that, you know, it's harder to find a contractor to install a heat pump than it is to find a contractor who will install natural gas. So I think that the real challenge is sort of bridging this imagination gap for our politicians, but also for the populace to let everyone know, you know, if we commit, we can, you know, it really is, if we build it, it will come. They will come, the prices will come down. And we're just short of that commitment. But I actually, my optimism is when the market flips. And so, you know, not a terribly liberal organization, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, quite conservative fiscally is projecting that the cost of the electric vehicle in the showroom will be equal in about 2025. That will be a huge watershed moment.
And I just to jump in on that, on some level, Saul, what you are talking about with respect to people's personal infrastructure, which you write about in the book, the machines that they use in their day-to-day lives, and the curves that you're talking about that make the efficient electric machines the no-brainer move for them to take as they replace the machines that fail. There's almost like a heroism to the heat pump installer and installee. But I'm curious how we connect that, how we connect the action that we're seeking to have people take en masse across their homes to the kind of institutional and individual activism that you write about so eloquently, Bill, and have led on for decades. Said another way, how do we take the market moving activity that you all were just discussing into an enlarged base for climate action?
Actually, oh, sorry if I could jump in on this question. I think it's great because Bill is almost I'm going to invite a little bit of a punch up here. Bill, you deserve a lot of credit for starting the sort of various divestment campaigns, which really focused a lot of people's minds on stopping investing in fossil fuels. But most of those divestment campaigns stopped short of the retail consumer. So they very much focused on the producers of oil, the producers of coal. I've always wondered in those divestment campaigns why we don't include Toyota or Ford, because 2% of the world's emissions go through a motor that Toyota made or that Ford made. And my hypothesis is we're a little bit uncomfortable talking about that problem because that's a thing that we own and we therefore are complicit in. But I think the narrative that we're trying to push now is actually that really should be a bit of a relief, because it means now that we have the options on the table, we have heat pumps, we have electric vehicles, we have rooftop solar, that you can engage the general public as being part of the solution. And we redrew the energy and emissions map for the US. And it turns out that about 42% of our emissions are the result of decisions that are made around kitchen tables. So what fuel goes in your cars, what cooks your dinner, what heats your home, what heats your water, where you purchase your electricity from. And that's not to blame the household. I actually, in some respects, I try to mea culpa in the book on behalf of everyone. We lived pretty comfortable lives through the 20th century because we did it the way we did it with fossil fuels. But now we have another option where we can engage every household in the country and every household in the world in the solution in a big and meaningful way. Because if you also include the small businesses whose decisions are also made around those kitchen tables, the amount of the emissions that stem from those decisions is more than half of all of our emissions. So I think there's an interesting.
Yeah, to go back to the original question, the reason actually that people have gone so hard after the fossil fuel industry with things like divestment had mostly to do with the hope, so far realized to some extent, of breaking their political power. We just watched the biggest recipient of fossil fuel largesse in Washington, Prime Minister Manchin, got the clean energy pricing plan out of the Build Back Better bill, the single thing that would have gotten us farthest down this road most quickly, I think. And it's a sort of good reminder that that this is not entirely a contest of reason that's playing out here. It's also a contest of vested interest. So I'm glad that we've been able to diminish their social political license to the extent that at least we can be having these kind of conversations in Congress. But we've still got a ways to go, I think. Witnessed the fact, for instance, and this, I don't know if you've noticed this, but it was a remarkable example of what one's up against. In Oklahoma last week, the utility announced that anybody who wanted to cut their gas connection and electrify their home instead would have to pay a $1,300 exit fee to the utility in order to go electrify their homes. So the political battle remains in full force, and we'll have to fight it. But here's a way of,
I personally paid an $800 disconnection fee recently.
there you go.
Unbelievable.
One of the most dynamic climate champions in the political realm, a 34-year-old woman named Michelle Wu took over as mayor of Boston yesterday. First time in its history, Boston didn't elect a white guy to run its affairs. And Michelle's fantastic, but now she's completely committed. But now she's got the city of 300,000 or 400,000 dwellings there. So if you're the mayor of Boston trying to figure out how you're going to get them all on heat pumps, what's job one? Do you start training people to install them? Do you call in the utility to go to work? Do you just start hectoring your constituents to each one do the right thing? What's the way, given that we have the scientists give us 8 or 10 years to do this task, if we want to catch up with the physics of climate change, what are the, and this is one of the places where I think your discussion of kind of mortgages and things was one of the most interesting parts of the whole book.
And I think your question is perfect. I feel like the book is a success and we're making progress on climate if the question is no longer will we do it with biofuels or carbon sequestration, but the fuel is how do we electrify all of the citizens in Boston in some fair and equitable way on time and to schedule. So I'm going to count a little victory there if we're getting the conversation there. And then I think the questions become very interesting. Maybe my answer won't satisfy you, but I think absolutely you need some regulatory work. In every energy market, regulations now are as much as 50% of the cost of retail energy. So cleaning up the regulations in Boston, let's use Boston as the example, cleaning up the regulations in Boston that probably exist in favor of natural gas, because it used to be called town gas in Boston many, many years ago. So for more than a century, we've been writing building codes. We've been writing rules that favor putting in gas easily. Certainly, as it was my experience, I lived in Cambridge, neighboring Boston, and every house I had a natural gas furnace. And whenever it broke, we had to call a contractor who didn't know how to install a heat pump. So clean up the regulatory work. And I think that requires some civic engagement. I think the political movement that's needed in every city and town is the movement of 3 or 4 people who are required or who would meaningfully change council meetings if they showed up to work on building codes. The 3 or 4 people who would meaningfully change rate hearings for the utility regulations, which impact the codes and policies. Then we need workforce training. In fact, today we were advocating on the Hill for focusing our community colleges on workforce training that not only builds capacity, but always also lowers the cost of installation. And to give you an illustration of that, rooftop solar in Australia is less than 1/3 of the price of rooftop solar in the US. And it, even despite the fact that Australia has a higher prevailing wage and it's $35 an hour for the installers of that solar. What they did that was very, very clever, which I think they did accidentally, is they ran a certification and training program to train the installer to not only be the installer, but to be the inspector. It moved the liability for anything that's going wrong to the certification agency, which made sure the certification agency did a spectacular job training the workforce. And that was largely responsible for why it's so much cheaper there. So I would advocate that we need to do that for rooftop solar. We need to do that for vehicle charging infrastructure. Getting 250 million vehicles charged is a lot of jobs installing a lot of vehicle charging network. We absolutely need to do that for HVAC, which broadly means heat pumps for water and space heat. And we need that, we probably are short 1 million electricians in the country's workforce if we're to do this by 2035 on the timeframe required to meet our climate goals. So after the regulatory work, I'd start the training programs. I'd engage the high schools and the community colleges in that. And then I would look at every single possible way to buy down the upfront cost and develop the market. So that means for low-income houses, rebates that make sure that these things are. The reality is today, if your water heat, 40% of people who go out to buy a water heater are buying it under financial duress. Probably their partner is pregnant or ill. It's either the middle of winter or the middle of summer. You need it tomorrow. You buy the cheapest natural gas machine that you can buy, and it's installed tomorrow, and it's the least efficient and most. So I think we then need to design all sorts of stimulus and rebate programs so that when that person is making that decision at that point of purchase, we have made the electric heat pump the cheapest option. That will probably need to be true for about 5 more years to get the training up and the costs down. So there is a little bit of moment here for the market to be stimulated with those types of rebates. And then I'd look further to the idea of the mortgage that's mentioned in the book. You really can now model out that if you can afford the slightly increased cost of the solar, of the heat pumps, of the electric vehicles, the operational cost over the lifetime saves, in 2021, more than half, as much as 80% of every household in the US would be saving money. But by 2025, it's a slam dunk. We invented a thing to solve this problem of things that are expensive up front but cheaper later. And we invented auto finance in 1920s in the US, and we invented housing finance in 1935, the creation of Fannie Mae in the US. And I think those two, I hate to say this as an engineer and a scientist and as a technologist, but I think those two creations of those financing products had a bigger influence on what the 20th century looked like than all of the technology that we developed, because it made these things affordable for everyone everywhere. So I think we need to look at also creating those financial instruments. Just a last word on that. I've had the great fortune of living in Australia for the last 9 months because of the pandemic. And it's a great fortune because in some respects, it's a peek into the future. Because of that really cheap solar on the roofs, Australians are now demanding electric vehicles. They're demanding electric heat. And in fact, 2 separate banks, one of them Macquarie Bank, one of them Commonwealth Bank. One of them was kind enough to say, we've been listening to your podcast and your ideas about financing, and we've created 5 banking products to finance these items in these household upgrades, and we're going to help people finance them against their home loans or their car loans, whichever is relevant. And so I'm seeing in Australia that these things are coming into existence. Now there's the demand, and now that the prices in the market are getting there. So that's a long list of recommendations for what the mayor. So the first thing the mayor needs to do is all of the above in Boston to get us there. That's because of the urgency that I think you and I both share.
So one thing I would just jump in on, and then Bill, I want to ask you another question here, and sort of like flip it back to you on the question that you just asked. One thing that we have been hearing from mayors as we've been going out and talking to them about this Mayors for Electrification Coalition, and frankly talking to them about climate action, is the same thing we've been hearing from political leaders generally, which is how do we connect the dots between what we need to do on climate, the imperative for action, with people's real life experience. And so one of the things that I am very excited about personally with respect to that is that mayors can grab hold of the issue, because it's about returning dollars to their constituents in a very local way. It's sort of like the climate version of potholes, which is not bad politically. And I'm wondering, Bill, from your perspective, as you kind of think about it, what's the toolbox for the incoming mayor in Boston? How would you answer that question? What's your perspective on that as she takes office and sets an example as a climate leader across the country?
Well, I mean, I think actually we're sort of at an interesting point, at least in some places, like say Boston, where some of the work of activists and advocates is we've done the most important work we can do, which is to get people to this stage. And now there's an extraordinary amount of execution to be done. And that's a different set of tasks. Yeah. And that's really what, in some places anyway, this decade is going to be about. And I think that the kind of networks of activists and advocates are going to be important. because there's going to be, there are going to be fights all along the way here, in every way. One of the fights that's already popping up around America is people's unwillingness to cite renewable energy in lots of places, and especially in the Northeast. But that's that's going to be one of these ongoing questions. And I think the reason that Saul's book is so important, and some of this other work in the last year or so is so important, the work of Mark Jacobson at Stanford, laying out energy plans for one country after another on renewable energy, this remarkable new study from Oxford demonstrating that a fast transition to renewables saves trillions of dollars net, even before you factor in the avoided cost of destroying the planet, on and on. I think that it sets us up for this kind of large scale sea change in attitude now. And so I think that's truly important. And I'm curious from Saul of a couple of things. There's a couple of technical things I wish he would talk about, because I think these are things that continue to worry people a lot and or cause them a certain amount of confusion. One is, talk for a little bit, and the work in the book on this is very interesting. Talk for just a minute about the relative usefulness of sun and wind versus nuclear power, because that's the other way we could low carbon electrify things. And then talk about the challenge that's emerging, I think, around the, it's clear that the conversion to electrifying things would, in the end, mean we're doing a lot less mining in the world, but we're going to have to do a lot to get there, and it's going to be of stuff we don't really have enough of right now. And there are big human rights and environmental challenges around that, some of that work around lithium and cobalt and whatever else. And those are things too we need to be thinking about, because they could politically derail some of this momentum even as it gets going.
They're both great topics. So let's talk about nuclear first. I'm sort of a neutral party on nuclear. You can say with an honest face that nuclear has, in some net lives impacted per megawatt hours of energy delivered. It's really one of the safest forms of energy we've had over the last few centuries. But we have over the last 50 years, but we have had a couple of spectacular accidents that could have been worse, and so the human imagination imagines far worse. But all in all, it statistically is very safe. The real challenge, so I don't have an objection. There's quite a lot of uranium. There's probably 1,000 years supply of the fissile materials that if humans went that way. Sorry, I just saw Bill freeze and I'm wondering, I hope I haven't frozen. So there's plenty of it. The reality is that we still don't have a solution for where we put the waste, particularly in the US. And in fact, most of the nuclear waste from power plants is still stored on site, basically in glorified swimming pools, because we haven't been able to find a politically palatable place to bury it deeply in the ground or otherwise process it. So there's still a concern about the wastes. There's still a concern about security. What's not recognized is that nuclear is one of the technologies that we use, a thermoelectric cycle to turn into electricity. That means that you boil water with it, use that water to spin a turbine that runs a generator that provides electricity to the grid. Most people won't know that about 41% of all fresh water in the US currently goes through one of these thermoelectric power plants, be it coal, natural gas, or nuclear. Let's say that already we have water table stresses everywhere. So that's we're approaching the limit of water that we can push through these plants, because you warm it up and you can't warm up the creek on the other side too much without killing the fish and the frogs. So if 41% of our water is the limit, nuclear could only supply about a quarter of the electricity if we electrified all of the end users. So It might not even scale as well as people think. Now, there are people working on ways to cool it without using water. There are people working on next generation reactors. But remember, the emissions that count the most to cut right now are the ones you can count soonest. In the US, we've only approved one reactor in the last 40 years now. So it took 40 years to get through. So what I would say is I'm tepidly in favor of increasing a little bit the amount of nuclear in the US. I don't think politically you'll ever stop America having nuclear power if it wants to also have a nuclear military capacity. So we may as well manage it wisely and use enough of it to make the rest of the challenge that we have ahead of us easier. If we were producing 10 or 20% of the electricity for the US through nuclear, then it drastically lowers the amount of batteries. It makes getting through our winter lulls much, much easier. So I think the sensible path is to at least keep the reactors we have and maybe build as many again in the next few decades. I have doubts that will be politically possible for exactly the reason you mentioned. There's the not in my backyard syndrome in the US very strongly. Looking around the world, you can say that there are less countries that can do this transition without any nuclear at all. Australia, Canada, the US, Russia, countries with very large land masses, low population densities relative, can do it. Certainly, it's hard to imagine Southeast Asia solving this problem without using some nuclear. So I think pragmatically, you also need to be in the business of it because it will be used globally. But I do think that there are nuclear advocates that want it to be all of the solution. That's not going to happen. It's not going to be the cheapest energy source. Even if nuclear energy could provide electricity for free onto the US grid, it would be more expensive than rooftop solar is on a rooftop in Australia. So the answer is there's going to be a blend. You should probably temper your enthusiasm for nuclear on the water limitations front and on the political reality of getting enough of it installed in the next 20 years to really make an impactful difference. So maybe I'll give you an opportunity to rebut those, or maybe you had something else you wanted me to say about nuclear.
No, that's fascinating. And I think the cost thing is dispositive in a lot of ways. But I was interested also in that question around minerals and supply and getting ahead of the question of the human rights and environmental challenges around them.
Yeah, so I think this is an issue we absolutely should be wary of. I've personally visited Kenya and been very close to where we are killing gorillas for mining some of the rare earths in the world because it's been used for bushmeat for underpaid miners in those regions. I think it is a truism that we actually do have the technology now to address climate change, but we could still choke the oceans in plastics, and we could still lose, our closest genetic relatives, the great apes, this century. So I think that's the reason why we actually have to care. I'm going to give you a little bit of the optimistic version, and that's to compare this challenge to standard practice. So the average American today, about 6 tons, 6,000 kilograms of fossil fuels is burned every year for every American. That just goes up into the atmosphere. None of it is recycled. If you do very cursory math on what it would take to supply an American with their whole lifestyle, same size car, but electric, same size house, but electric heat, et cetera, and we were going to do that 50% with solar energy, 50% with wind energy, and because it's solar and wind, we're going to store 50% of it in batteries. It turns out you'd only need about 50 kilograms of wind turbines, 50 kilograms of solar, and 50 kilograms of batteries for each person each year. And as my original degree was in metallurgy, and as a metallurgist, it turns out that most of the components of most of those things are very highly recyclable metals. And we should, as with the 2 most recycled materials in the world are steel and aluminum, and if we are clever and we build these systems around circular economy, we should be able to recycle 80% or more of all of those metals. And so that 50 kilograms per person per year goes down to 10-ish kilograms per person per year. So if you compare the 6,000 kilograms of stuff that we push through ecosystems all around the world right now, and you compare that to 30, I think there's a lot of room for optimism. But we need to be cautious. There were concerns that there wasn't going to be enough lithium. I think most scientists are now satisfied there's enough lithium. My concern is more about things like cobalt and the rare earths, which we should be more cautious about. And we are certainly going to need a lot more copper. And of all of the mining practices in the world, copper is one of the more destructive. So I think I think you need to have a very pragmatic approach to this question, which is, well, we don't really have another option for decarbonizing if we would like to have something like Western civilization. So we need to electrify, but we should be cautious about how we do the mining, and we should make sure we do the recycling. And then just as one bright light on that recycling front, JB Straubel, who was a very early, I think he was employee 5 at Tesla, is now running a very successful lithium battery recycling operation in Nevada that's scaling up very quickly. So I think we do have some of our best and brightest focused on this issue, which is good news.
Indeed.
So I want to pivot the conversation a bit, ask one more question, and then make sure we've got some time to take questions from folks who are dropping them in the Q&A. If you're dropping them in the chat, drop them in the Q&A, please, so we can pick them up. We referenced a few minutes ago the conversations in Washington around Build Back Better, which is we've had the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure framework signed into law just the other day by President Biden. Still not done is the climate, the major climate spending and social spending plan in Build Back Better. So we had a little bit of a dialogue just a few minutes ago about how the market trends are at play and driving down the cost curves and enabling these technologies to be affordable. But Rewiring America has been very involved in Build Back Better and pushing for rebates and incentives that will lower the cost of these efficient electric machines and help put money in the pockets of American families in order to address climate change. And we're not there yet. And so I would love to hear from both of you your perspective on why Build Back Better is important to addressing the current climate crisis, not just from a U.S. climate performance perspective, but also from a U.S. global leadership perspective. And Bill, I'd love for you to take that.
Sure. Look, I mean, all you had to do was be in Glasgow to sense the answer to that. The Glasgow meeting but came up very short, mostly because Joe Biden arrived with nothing. The plan was that Joe Biden was going to arrive with the Build Back Better bill in his back pocket and plunk it down on the table and challenge everybody else to, pony up too, and here we go. But, with the remarkable return on their investment that the fossil fuel industry gets for funding Joe Manchin, he gutted important parts of the bill and then delayed its passage to the point where Biden, showed up naked. And everybody in the world, who cared about this was watching and knew precisely what was going on. The US is the biggest historical emitter of carbon by a large margin. If we're not, able or willing to play a role, then, frankly, I mean, I'm not the most astute political analyst in the entire world, but it seems to me that the chances for big legislative action after the Build Back Better bill are very slim. It took us more than a decade to get from the last congressional attempt to do something about climate change to now, and the last one failed in 2009. So, this is the ultimate test for everyone to figure out how to get as good a bill passed as possible in the next few weeks. And it's, white knuckle time in a lot of ways, but this is the opportunity.
Saul, you want to jump in on that and talk about ambition level too?
At the risk of countermanding my editor's insistence on putting optimism in the title, I think we should have a frank conversation about this. I think one of my best days in 2020 was when the Biden administration said 50% reductions by 2030. That was the first science-based target announced by a major emitting nation in history. That was amazing. That was an aspirational goal. And it's a little hard to do the accounting because the dust hasn't settled, but let's be very crudely honest. We've maybe addressed 5 to 10% of emissions in what will be the fully packed Build Back Better Plus infrastructure deal. So that's a long way short of the target. I certainly wrote the book, and in fact, it's almost jingoistic at times about America, because using the American war, World War II, America really came to the world's rescue with decisive policy and then in a huge private-public partnership, which was the US government asking American industry to make things to win that war. And I think what everyone's memory of the best of America is the great America, even in Donald Trump's, what we would like to return to was that post-war America that was built on this incredible World War II manufacturing effort. And then there was manufacturing surplus, so they could build all of the things for the whole world through the 50s and 60s on the back of the Marshall Plan. And that was an astounding moment. And I think when I was writing the book, it's a long time between when you put the pen down and when the book gets published. It's more than 18 months. My worldview or theory of change was that you really needed the American government to go big here, to get the world to go along with it. And sadly, Bill is right. Biden showed up naked. I'm not sure how to turn that to optimistic, but I will try the following. I've been, again, to return to Australia where the future is happening, we are politically, the peers of Australia at the climate negotiations are Saudi Arabia and Russia. We're a petrostate disguised as a first world nation. And the politics are all about coal. And the politics were all about coal going into COP. And in fact, the Australian position was worse than pretty much everyone's at this COP, as it has been at all the previous ones. So you would think they're a terrible country on this issue, but behind the scenes, at state level, the Australian states have the most ambitious climate targets in the world. If you took the collection of the best piece of policy from the 7 Australian states, you have fully decarbonized nation by 2035. It's very much in conflict with the federal government, but even the federal government is coming around. Now they've scraped through and satisfied their fossil lobbying interests into COP. They're facing an electorate 70 to 80% because of the fires in 2019, 2020, are demanding change on climate change. And because they've experienced very cheap solar, they're demanding, they know what the solution is. It's cheap solar, it's electrifying their lives. And maybe my new theory of the next biggest leverage point is to get Australia to prove to the world, here's what it looks like. And you can see cities and towns now vying to be electrified and zero carbon first. And I actually think it's that city to city work now, and it's mayors and it's local councils. And it's, I actually really do subscribe that it's going to be the race to the top. Just as we were hoping for the world's ambition to be raised by Joe Biden, I'm hoping that every mayor's ambition is raised by the woos of this world as they decarbonize their cities. I think that is where the best hope for rapid climate action is now. It's in the city that can first stand on the global stage and say, you know what, despite of our cold weather, or despite of the fact that we're a rainy city, or whatever it is, because everyone's slightly handicapped in one front, we managed to do it first, and then that will beget more ambition everywhere else. I think, and because we need a plethora of solutions, I think the cities are natural testing grounds for all of the, the local generic architecture differences and how that plays out. And so I'm excited now to, precisely because I think mechanisms like COP are not working, we need to think in that more local, more city, more state-based way. Although I'd be interested in Bill's opinion. Just one last thought. I'm also interested in Bill's opinion. I think COP, I was reflecting on the failure of COP. The mechanism is designed for countries to get to zero carbon within their own national boundaries, which necessitates a nationalist look at their energy systems. And for most countries, it's very difficult to solve climate change within your own geographic boundaries. And so they lean back on nationalist policies that look like fossil fuels. And I'm wondering how that interacts.
Yes, and the other problem with that is that it does, I mean, we're talking entirely about the demand problem here, but there's a supply problem too, exemplified by Australia, which, even if it got its own act in order, delights in shipping cheap coal to the rest of the world. And the same in the US, where today Joe Biden approved 80 million acres of oil leasing in the Gulf of Mexico, So yes, this is an ongoing set of problems. And we're in danger of becoming less optimistic than we promised here. But I think it's kind of a reminder of the fact that we really do have this one path forward. So we better figure out how to make it happen at every possible level. And I'll just say, I think realistically, we better figure out some ways to have it happen at the more than municipal level if we're going to get it done in the time that we're talking about here.
You would like, yes, I think the bigger geographic region that can say we did it and prove to the world that it's possible, that is absolutely critical. Norway might get there just by the luck of having France and Denmark in proximity. But you'd like something that's a little harder case than Norway to be the proof point.
Were we all Norwegians, the world would work just fine. That's it. Yes.
There you go.
Well, I guess part of the optimism could be Norway, but part of the optimism could also just be the clarity of the path, right? You said earlier, Bill.
That's right.
That
And
really
that's why let me just say that, I mean, among other things, we should remind people to go buy this book because it is a really good book. I mean,
rewiringamerica.org.
Quite straightforwardly.
Well, thank you.
Yes, we amen to that. I think I wanted to Bill, I want to have carve time for two questions that have come in. There have been so many, and we will. Some folks have asked whether we're going to preserve this discussion, and the answer to that is yes. And we will share it back so that folks can have a record of it and watch it at their leisure. But I think, Bill, you said a minute ago that we got to do more than just have it happen at the local level, which makes a ton of sense and is obviously critical. I actually want to go in two directions with that. One is to sort of take the thread from the beginning of the conversation about political action and sort of execution, to talk about what is the next step for the movement, broadly speaking, in your from your perspective, Bill. And then after you have a chance to answer that, Saul, I'm going to tee up a softball question for you that you will love about schools.
Okay, I'll just say quickly, I think a lot of the attention of movements is going to be turning towards financial institutions, banks, asset managers, insurance companies. At the moment, they're the money pipeline to the fossil fuel industry. A bank like Chase has lent the fossil fuel industry $250 billion since Paris. They didn't need Donald Trump to sabotage it. They were willing to do it themselves, But they also could hold a lot of the key in terms of precisely what Saul was talking about earlier. I mean, the development of financial products that allow people, cities, businesses, everybody else to rapidly transform their infrastructure is crucial here. And there's probably no substitute, for better or for worse, in the short term for that role that financial institutions are going to play here. So one of the things I think that's happening in Washington right now that's really important is a lot of pressure on the Fed, the Treasury, others to try and move the financial sector, and activists the same way. My last trip before lockdown was getting arrested in Washington, not outside the White House, but in the lobby of the Chase Bank nearest the Capitol. And you know, it's going to take a lot of pressure like that to turn these guys from villains into supporters.
Thank you for that, Bill. Saul, I want to go from the zoomed out view to the local view. Juanita Hendricks asked this question that just seemed too perfect not to share. My well-meaning county sees that its 200 schools are a huge energy emissions source. They want to, quote, do something, so have a plan to, quote, green some existing schools and plan for future schools to have more green features. But a large part of the county's plan for schools is to go from having 10% of our county school energy costs paid with RECs to moving it to 50%. Everything I have read suggests this is foolhardy. Any words of advice as to how to let county schools know going with RECs may be not the best strategy to get your emissions to zero? Thank you. And I'll add, and therefore, what can be done?
Juanita, thank you for your question. I have a friend, Sam Kalish. He was among two friends who helped me write the book, which I'm going to shamelessly plug there. Laura Fraser was the other. She's lurking, asking the hard questions in the chat, I see. Sam is extremely passionate about electrifying the nation's 100,000 schools. And in fact, he and I both received a fabulous email from a high school student in California who said he would like to put a megawatt of solar on every high school in the US. And he had done his calculations and showed that you would actually supply a significant portion of US energy supply if you did so. And he even pointed at a school in New Mexico, I've forgotten the name of it right now, that has a 1.5 megawatt solar array and a huge megawatt hour battery. That electricity will be much, much cheaper than RECs for those schools. Because the schools' loads are somewhat light. Most schools will be able to produce excess electricity and actually feed it into their communities. And we were actually discussing again on the Hill today the other benefits. You know, we could be charging at very low cost the vehicles for all of the nation's all of the teachers in the nation. And the nice thing about school buses is they drive a little bit in the morning and a little bit in the afternoon, but they need huge batteries, so we can actually use them as a demand response resource. And in fact, there's a company called Proterra in California that's already down this pathway. I think a national program, maybe I wish we knew how to name it right now on the air tonight, but I think a national program that's building capacity by training the future renewable energy advocates of the nation by putting solar on 100,000 schools and using the local community college, hopefully training program, so that we're building capacity to put solar and batteries in throughout the rest of the buildings in the nation. That's the scale of thinking we need to think about. And the answer is that will be the cheapest way for those schools to electrify. But to Bill's point, we'll need some nice banks to come to the party. But what bank won't want to, after the last couple of years that we've had, won't want to help finance with low-cost financing the nation's schools to build the future we need? I think we should be able to find wins here. There's my optimism, shamelessly coming up to the top.
I love the shameless optimism. And why don't we end with each of you giving your optimistic the one thing that people should do to sort of practice the optimism of the climate imperative that we have. And Bill, as you do that, if you could share a little bit about Third Act, I think.
Oh, sure. Well, actually, that goes right to the question. I mean, I think one of the things that's been clear here is, as we discuss this, that despite the fact that this is the obvious rational solution going forward, that doesn't mean that it's going to happen by itself. And you know, the important fights in our world are never about reason and evidence. They're always about money and power. And we're going to have to win that battle before we can win the other one. So organizing remains important. If there are clearly young people are doing a great job of organizing now around climate and energy. We need older people, which is why we've started this group Third Act for people over the age of 60. We have, among other things, 70% of America's financial assets compared with 5% for millennials. That's not particularly fair, but it's reality. And so if we're going to put pressure on these crucial institutions, we're going to need a few of us with hairlines like mine taking part. And so I hope that, tell your parents, your grandparents, get them engaged.
So when I started Rewiring America with Alex Lasky, who hopefully is listening, or I'll see him later tonight, we violently agree with you, Bill. We said we don't need more Gretas. We need an AARP for climate. So AARP is the American Association of Retired People. It's, the joke in Washington is that it has its own zip code. It has its hands in every piece of legislation. It makes the NRA look trifling in terms of its organizational capacity. And I'm really passionate about the how of, and I don't know that we know how to do it. You're obviously already working on it, but how do we create the centrist, sensible climate movement that can embrace, honestly, people who are overtaxed? I think about 2 income households with 2 working parents and a couple of kids and a bunch of commuting. And you got to think about, how do they succeed in this climate journey we all have to go on, and how do they engage with activism where they can't quite afford to tie themselves to a fence anymore? So I think there's this incredible opportunity in the US, around the world, to create a new kind of advocacy in the middle that is, literally fighting for our children. And I think imagining the various ways we can get to build that AARP for climate that's exciting to me.
Well, thank you both. I would say it was an honor to share the room with you, but it's a Zoom room, so I guess it's an honor to share the screen with you. Really deeply appreciate the engaging conversation, the honesty, the urgency, and Saul, the optimism too. As I said, we will make this conversation available on rewiringamerica.org. We hope folks take the time to check out Third Act and everything that Bill is doing. Take some time to come to rewiringamerica.org and see some of the data and the reports and the policies that we are pushing for in conjunction with the blueprint that Saul has laid out. Take a chance at reading Saul's book, which you can get through rewiringamerica.org, which is just a way for you to stay in touch with us. And let's all do our part to ratchet the ambition so that we can all maintain the optimism about executing in the decade ahead. So thank you all. Have a great evening. Saul, I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Ari.
Take care, y'all. Good work.
Bye.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our noon webinar. We're really glad you're here because we have a lot to talk about in terms of electric vehicle incentives today. So we will go right ahead and get started as people are coming in and settling in. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We're a nonprofit organization doing work in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. We do that in 2 ways. We run consumer-facing programs that help people access clean energy technologies, and we do public policy advocacy work at the state level, and each of those 2 pieces feed into each other. In both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, on transportation specifically, we run a program called Drive Green, which helps people access clean energy technologies. And by that, I mean electric vehicles. That was autopilot. We talk about EVs. I will say my name is Anna Vanderspeck. I'm the Electric Vehicle Program Director, and I clearly need to wake up today. And I'll let my colleague Devin introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Devin DeLibero. I am the program coordinator on the Drive Green team, and I'll be talking to you in just a little bit. Anna and I are sharing this presentation today.
So with that, we have a lot to cover today. So we have a strict outline that we'll keep to. We'll start with some context just in general to remind ourselves where we've been and how we've gotten here in terms of electric vehicle incentives. Devin will talk about incentives for individuals. So we'll break that out into incentives for the vehicles themselves, incentives for charging equipment, and incentives for electric bikes. And then we'll talk about incentives for businesses broken out into the same two buckets of cars and charging equipment. And it's at this point that I would like to launch a couple of polls to get a sense of who is in the audience, because that'll help us determine how much time to spend on various topics. So the first question I have for you all is if you already own an electric vehicle. So you should now see a poll on your screen. I see people are responding. I'll give us another second or two to look at responses. Okay, it looks like we've got about a third of people who already have an electric vehicle, and then 3% who get around by other means. Good for you. And then a big majority in the middle that's not yet either convinced the next car will be electric or still learning. That is excellent. And then we would love to know what you're most interested in learning about. We'll talk about all of these things. So it's incentives for individuals and commercial or public fleets. And we'll talk about the vehicles and charging, but curious to see what people are most interested in. And on this poll, you can check more than one response. So if you're interested in learning about all four, you can check off all four. Ooh, numbers are changing quickly here. Okay, we are seeing a strong preference for incentives for individuals, so we can spend the most time on that. But there's a healthy cohort of people who are interested in incentives for fleets. So basically the first section here, incentives for individuals, we'll spend the most time on that, but we'll cover the other information too. And then last question is very easy. We need to know where you live. So we can figure out how much time to spend on incentives for each state. We'll definitely cover Massachusetts and Rhode Island, as we always do. Looks like a majority from Massachusetts, but a healthy number from Rhode Island too. Okay, thank you very much for those responses, and we will go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned earlier, when my brain wasn't working yet, we run a program called Drive Green, and we have lots of information about electric vehicles on our website. This webinar will focus specifically on incentives, so we're not going to spend any time talking about how charging works or the different electric vehicle models or how to get them. But we want to remind you that all of that information is available on our website, and we have lots of other webinars on those topics coming up. So definitely check out our Drive Green website if you want more basic information about EVs. But today we're talking about incentives. So we'll move right along to some context and specifically a brief history of electric vehicle incentives, just so that we can sort of place ourselves in time. So the first iteration of the federal tax credit started in 2008 when President Obama implemented a tax credit for electric vehicles, basically as part of the recovery from the recession. Massachusetts moved first in 2014 to launch the More EV state rebate program for electric vehicles, which is the program that's still running today, although it's been through several iterations and has had different rules since 2014. Rhode Island first took action in 2016 when they launched the Drive electric vehicle rebate program, but that very quickly ran out of funding and closed a year later. In August of last year, the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and if you've attended any of our IRA webinars or even our Electric Vehicle 101 webinars since then, you know that that has been a really big deal. Some new provisions went into effect on August 16th, but then some others are phasing in over time. In 2022, Rhode Island relaunched the DRIVE program, which we'll talk about today, and Massachusetts set up a new fund for electric vehicle incentives and funded it with $50 million. And so the combination of those state and federal incentives should move EV adoption forward quite a bit. And then starting just this year, more provisions from the Inflation Reduction Act kicked in, and that's what we'll spend a good chunk of time talking about today because they are complicated. Before we get into those, I want to make one distinction of two big federal game changers happened in the last couple of years, and we want to make it clear which one we're focusing on today. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed into law in November 2021. You might hear it referred to as the IIJA, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This made a lot of funding available that our two states are both working with. So particularly, you might have heard of the NEVI program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, that is paying for new DC fast charging stations along highways. And then there's the Clean School Bus program that's paying for electric buses. All of that is very exciting, but not what we're going to talk about today. The Inflation Reduction Act, which I've already mentioned, the IRA, was signed into law in August of 2022. It is the largest investment in climate this country has ever seen, and it particularly includes tax credits for electric vehicles and for charging infrastructure. And those are the two pieces when we're talking about federal programs today. Those are the two pieces we'll be talking about. But with that, I will hand it over to my colleague Devin to talk about incentives for individuals.
All right. Thank you, Anna, for that great introduction. I don't think I have control of the slide, so if you just want to hit the next slide for me, please. Okay, so like Anna mentioned before, the IRA set into motion some new tax credit qualifications for the clean vehicle credit. So this happens from 2023 and beyond. It's about a 10-year span. It lasts till 2033. Anna, could you just hit?
Sorry, Devin, I think if you try again, it should work once I've muted myself and given you control again.
Okay. Right, so the new tax credit, like I said, goes into effect in 2023. And one thing you want to know about that is that there is a website from the a webpage on the IRS website that shows you all the manufacturers and models that are eligible for this new clean vehicle credit. So if you are unsure, definitely check out this link when we send it around after the presentation. It'll show you which cars are eligible and which manufacturers are working with the government to make sure that their cars are eligible. Oh, sorry, it is valid through 2032 because it was started in 2022. What it does do, though, is it gets rid of the 200,000 unit cap that was originally in place for the previous iteration of the federal tax credit, where manufacturers only had 200,000 electric vehicles to sell until the federal tax credit started to phase out for their vehicles. So as an example, Tesla and GM hit that mark quite some time ago, and so there has been no federal tax credit for them for a few years. This new clean vehicle credit does come with some income requirements, though. So it's $300,000 or less for joint filers and $150,000 or less for individual filers. A new addition to this is that fuel cell vehicles are now included, not just electric vehicles. So if you're interested in those, you can definitely check that out. And there are new vehicle requirements, which makes this very complicated, and we will talk about that next. So the first thing that the IRA did was make it so that there is a final assembly location requirement for all of the vehicles that can be eligible for the federal tax credit. This started in August 16, 2022, when the IRA went into effect, and it is in effect for the duration of this federal tax credit. So make sure that the final assembly location of your vehicle is in North America if you want to have a vehicle that is eligible for the federal tax credit. There is now a price cap on some of these vehicles. So the price cap is based on your MSRP. So if you buy the car for more than the MSRP and it goes over, like, say, the $80,000 for SUVs, pickups, and vans, you'll still be eligible for the federal tax credit because the original MSRP of the vehicle was at or below that $80,000 limit. With that being said, there's also a $55,000 limit for sedans and hatchbacks. One thing we learned this week that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention is previously there was some confusion about what qualified as an SUV, but know that the whatever it says on the sticker of the car, so when you're looking at the car, if it says SUV, if the EPA rates it as an SUV, it is considered to be an SUV, and that's how you will know if the price cap is $80,000 or not. Okay. The third part is probably the most complicated part. It's the battery part. So that's the mineral and battery component requirements. So this kicks in maybe in March of 2023. We say maybe because it was supposed to be in effect as of January 1st of this year. Unfortunately, the IRS has not figured out a way to properly vet this to know whether a car has their battery components and minerals made in the appropriate places or put together in the appropriate places. So they said March. We don't have a date in March, and I am not certain that we will know even in March, so it may take some more time. Here's what the expected guidance is in March of 2023. Again, this is a rough date. So the battery requirements are what make this a little bit tricky. So each different requirement for these bullet points I'll talk to you about, it is half of the federal tax credit. So the first bullet point is $3,750 of the federal tax credit, and the second is the latter $3,750. As of right now, until March or whenever they make new guidance, these are not in effect for a short window of time. So if you get your car before these guidelines are put forth, that's great, and you could potentially get the full $7,500 tax credit. So the first component of this is 40% of battery minerals must be mined or processed in North America or a country that has a free trade agreement with the US or recycled in the US. So as you can see, it can be a little bit tricky to figure out how exactly that happens. The second requirement is that 50% of the value of battery components must be manufactured or assembled in North America. Both of these percentages will ramp up over time, but these are the initial percentages that will be set forth once guidance is issued. Another great thing about the new clean vehicle tax credit is that it allows for used vehicles to qualify now. Here is a list of manufacturers and models of qualified used cars that you can look at on the IRS website. One fantastic thing about that is the battery requirements do not apply, so you don't have to worry about that at all. It gives you a tax credit of $4,000 or 30% of the sale price, whichever is lower. But you must buy the vehicle from a dealership, so you can't just buy it from like a friend or on Craigslist or something like that. This must be at least 2 years old. The car must be 2 years old and cost $25,000 or less. And it only applies to first resale. So if somebody already claimed the used car credit for that vehicle, you cannot then claim another credit for that same vehicle. It does have a lower income threshold. So for joint filers, it's $150,000. And for an individual filer, it is $75,000. What I will stress about both the new and the used tax credit is that it is based on your personal tax liability. So if this is an option for you, if you're considering getting an EV because of the tax credit, just make sure that your tax liability lines up with the money that you're expecting to receive from the government. This is definitely my favorite piece of all of this. So starting in 2024, this federal tax credit could move to a point of sale rebate. And so what that means is the consumer can transfer the tax credit to the dealership, and the dealership can then absorb that and give the customer a point of sale rebate. The details of this process are still TBD. We're really not sure. My guess is that the government gave themselves until 2024 to figure out all the details of this matter. So we'll see what happens in the new year. Just to transition a little bit to state rebates, now that we've talked about federal tax incentives. So Massachusetts has the More EV rebate program, which is a really fantastic program. I have two columns here. One's for now and one is coming soon because there are some new things coming soon. We just don't know exactly when. But for now, there is a $3,500 rebate for battery electric vehicles. That's an all electric vehicle, and a $1,500 rebate for plug-in hybrids with 25 miles of electric range or more. The final sales price for a battery electric vehicle is $55,000. That's including taxes and like everything that you pay on the bottom line. And for a plug-in hybrid, the max sales price is $50,000. So just excuse that typo. Note that you can do this for purchase or lease, but if you do lease, you need to make sure that the terms of your lease are at least 36 months. And you must apply online after the purchase on More EV's website. So make sure you do that as well. Okay, so coming soon. The rebate coming soon, it can be anywhere from $3,500 to $5,000. We don't have the specifics, but we know that those are the options. We do know that they're going to get rid of the incentive for plug-in hybrids. So if that's something you have your eye on now, sooner rather than later is a good time to get your plug-in hybrid. It will in the future apply to both used and new cars. So that's something to look forward to. And additional rebates for low-income drivers and drivers who are trading in gas cars will be made available. Again, I'm not sure what those are yet, but we know that those are coming. And they're also working on making this an authorized point of sale rebate, so you don't then have to go and apply online through More EV's website to get the rebate, and there's no waiting period. And then just a note that says last year's Climate and Economic Development bills created a $50 million EV adoption incentive fund, so details on that are to be discussed. Okay. So now we mentioned earlier that Rhode Island has a new, or now new to me because I wasn't around then, but a new Drive Up electric vehicle rebate. So it's called Drive EV or Drive EV Plus. It's a little bit different, but the price caps are for new cars at $60,000 and for used cars it's $40,000. You do have 120 days to apply for the rebate after you've bought the car from a Rhode Island dealership. So you have to be from Rhode Island and buy from a Rhode Island dealership in order to get this rebate. So we have two little charts here that break it up for new vehicles and for used vehicles. So we'll just focus on the battery electric and the plug-in hybrids. But for example, for a new battery electric vehicle, you can get a $2,500 rebate for just the regular Drive EV program. And if you are part of the Drive Plus program, you can get an additional $2,000. And Drive Plus is for those who have reached certain income requirements. They can get those additional funds. For a plug-in hybrid, a new one, you can get anywhere from $1,500 to $2,500 of a rebate. And then for used vehicles, it does decrease a little bit. So for a battery electric vehicle, anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000, and for a plug-in hybrid, it's anywhere from $750 to $1,500. So it's all good things. And if you have more questions about that, we have links to both the Drive EV website on this presentation and the More EV website, where they lay it out in even greater detail. And then we have the Federal Consumer Charging Infrastructure Tax Credit. This took me a little bit of time to understand, so just know that it's something you're definitely going to want to read into if you're interested in this. So this was also instituted by the IRA this summer. The amount is 30% of the cost of the charging infrastructure, not to exceed $1,000. And again, this is for individuals. And generally speaking, we say the cost of a charging station unit and the labor to install is about $1,200. So that's a pretty good deal. You may be able to transfer the credit to an installer to receive at point of sale, but the details of this are still being worked out, so we don't know when that's going to happen. There is more information you can check out at the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Tax Credit website. But what you really need to know is that all of this information is great, but it only applies to you if you live in a certain census tract. What that means is it cannot be an urban area. The poverty rate in your area is it has to be at least 20%, or the median family income is less than 80% of state median family income. So if you're interested in this, you'll have to do a little digging and research to make sure that you actually qualify for it. And I think I'm going to have Anna take over now as the Massachusetts person.
Yes, I'm happy to. One thing I'll add on the previous slide is that we don't know what census tracts are eligible yet. That is guidance that we're waiting for as well from the federal government. And our hope is as soon as there is a map where you can type in a zip code and figure out if your census tract qualifies or not, we will definitely share that information. So stay tuned on that front. But you may be able to know if you, for example, live in a rural area, you're likely to qualify, and you can start thinking about it, but the final details are still coming. So continuing on the theme of incentives for home charging, but moving from the federal level to the state level, we're going to talk about state incentives in Massachusetts to install charging stations. So Massachusetts has a program called Mass EVIP, which stands for Electric Vehicle Incentive Program. And that program is run out of the Department of Environmental Protection. And right now it only offers incentives for multi-unit dwellings. These are considered residences with at least 5 units. So not a triple decker, but maybe a 5-unit home. And there, Mass EVIP covers up to 60% of the hardware and installation costs of level 1 and level 2 charging stations. So if you live in a place that has 5 or more units, this is definitely an incentive program that you should take advantage of. And we're linking to more information on all of these slides, and we'll send those slides out so you can click on them and learn more. In addition, there is more funding coming in Massachusetts. I think my video might be frozen, but I hope you can still hear me. And if you can't, please let me know in the chat. But I'll keep going for now. So as we mentioned earlier, there was a big climate bill that passed in Massachusetts last year, and that set up a fund for electric vehicle incentives for the vehicles, but it also set up a fund for charging infrastructure deployment. So that was, the fund itself was set up by the climate bill, but then the economic development bill that passed later last year filled it with $50 million. Those $50 million, we don't know exactly how they're going to be distributed. It's possible that they'll go through Mass EVIP and basically just replenish the bucket of money for Mass EVIP programs, or the state might set up a new program with a different name. We don't know yet, but either way, there's $50 million coming for charging infrastructure. We also don't know if that will be limited to public charging infrastructure or home charging infrastructure, but it's still a thing to keep an eye on. And then our electric utilities, National Grid and Eversource, are offering new programs to support the infrastructure build out on the sort of utility side of the meter through make-ready programs, but they'll also be offering rebates for electric vehicle supply equipment, or EVSE, which is the official technical term for the actual station, the actual hardware that you install. So the Department of Public Utilities just approved Eversource and National Grid's programs, which total to about $400 million over the next 4 years. And that includes covering up to 100% of make-ready costs in all customer segments. So whether we're talking residential or public or workplace, and then some funding for the actual charging units and installation themselves. So we have a whole webinar dedicated to this next week that we encourage you to sign up for. And then we're hoping to have a series of webinars this spring with National Grid and Eversource as they actually roll out the programs, where we can talk about the details of how to sign up and what stations qualify and what don't. But for now, just know that all of this funding is coming in one form or another. And so as I mentioned, the dockets that the Department of Public Utilities just approved include funding or support both Make Ready, which is a term for the infrastructure side improvements that need to be made if you want to install charging, and also rebates for the actual hardware of the charging station and the installation. This is a snapshot of what the DPU approved for residential offerings, and it's broken out between homes that have 1 to 4 units and homes that have more than 5 units or 5 or more. In both cases, the utilities got the okay to pay for up to 100% of the Make Ready costs. But on the charging station side, it depends on the location or type of customer. So for 1 to 4 unit homes, you have to be enrolled on the utility's low income discount rate for your electric service and participate in the managed charging program. But if you meet those requirements, up to 100% of the charging unit costs will be covered. And if you are in a 5+ unit home, there's a sliding scale. So depending on how many criteria you meet of the state's definition for an environmental justice community, a different percentage of the costs of the charging station will be covered. I'm not going to spend too much time going into the details of this because we are still waiting for final program details from the electric utilities. They haven't yet had a chance to actually publish basically like the flyers they'll use or the website they'll use to explain all these rules. But just know this is coming, and if you live in one of these homes, you have a sense of what might be available in the coming months. Oops. Moving on to Rhode Island, there's nothing. This will be, unfortunately, a theme throughout this presentation, that Massachusetts has policies or resources to support charging infrastructure where Rhode Island is behind. So right now in Rhode Island, there are no incentives for the installation of home charging. On the electric bike front, Rhode Island is a little bit ahead of Rhode Island, so we can celebrate that here. Excuse me, Rhode Island is ahead of Massachusetts is what I meant to say. So in Massachusetts, the transportation bond bill that passed last year included $1 million for an e-bike rebate program. We know the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs has been looking into it, but so far there are no updates, there's no program yet. Relatedly, but not directly relevant, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center is currently funding some really exciting pilot programs with e-bikes. Most of them are around trying to gather some data about, okay, if you give people an e-bike or if people have access to an e-bike, how much do they use it? How many greenhouse gases does that e-bike prevent? And all of that data that the Mass Clean Energy Center is gathering should hopefully inform a state rebate program when the state actually sets one up. Rhode Island actually has an electric vehicle, or excuse me, an electric bike program. It's the Erica Nadowski Electric Bike Rebate Program. There's a standard rate rebate of $400 or 30%, whichever is lesser, for the final purchase of an e-bike or cargo e-bike. And then there is an income qualified rebate where the amount is higher. It's $1,000 or 75% of the cost of the bike, whichever is lesser. To qualify, you have to be a Rhode Island resident who's at least 18 years old. It's only for individuals, so you can't use this for a business. And you have to purchase the bike from a store in Rhode Island, or if you buy it online, it has to be delivered and picked up from a Rhode Island store. And for this rebate, you have to apply within 180 days of purchase, and we've linked to the website on the Office of Energy Resources website, so you can learn more and apply if it's relevant. So At Green Energy Consumers, we spend a lot of time talking about electric cars because we know that any vehicles that are on our roads need to be electric as soon as possible. But we also really need to reduce our reliance on personally owned vehicles. So if you can drive a car less or maybe replace a vehicle in your household with an electric bike, we absolutely encourage you to do that. And if you're lucky enough to live in Rhode Island, there's help available for you to do that. So that was the section on individuals, and I know that most attendees were interested in that information. We do have some information for businesses and also public entities and nonprofits that I'll go through, but I'll go through it a little bit faster than we did the other sections to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. So without further ado, we'll start with incentives for vehicles. So the IRA set up this new clean vehicle tax credit for individuals, but it also for the first time set up a commercial electric vehicle tax credit. So this amount is 30% of the sales price or the incremental cost of choosing an electric option over a fossil fuel powered option. It's capped at $7,500 for vehicles that are less than 14,000 pounds. And it's capped at $40,000 for vehicles that are over 14,000 pounds. So it's really exciting that this is available both for light duty vehicles that fleets might use, but also heavy duty vehicles. So thinking about buses and school buses and street sweepers and all of these things, there's now a federal tax credit available. The IRA has a really, really exciting provision called direct pay, which basically makes some of the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act available to tax-exempt entities, and that includes municipalities and nonprofits. And luckily, the electric vehicle tax credit for commercial entities is one of those tax credits that's available to tax-exempt entities. So if you are a municipality or a school district or a nonprofit and you have a fleet of vehicles, this is an incentive that's available to you to help bring down the cost of buying an electric vehicle of any size. And for more information, we will send you to everybody's favorite website, the IRS. Massachusetts has commercial vehicle incentives for electrification too. And this is a somewhat complicated chart, but this is the easiest way that we could figure out to display this information. So each row in this table is a different incentive program, and then we have columns that explain what those incentive programs are and what entities they're available to. So the top row is More EV. That's the same program that Devin was talking about earlier for individuals. That is now also available to commercial entities and nonprofits. It is not available to public entities, because public entities have a different program that they can apply to, which is the bottom row of this table, Mass EVIP. So I mentioned Mass EVIP earlier because it has a program to help install charging in multi-unit dwellings, but it also has a different sub-program that has incentives for public fleets. Those incentive numbers are on this chart, but basically More EV is for individuals, commercial entities, and nonprofits, and Mass EVIP fleets is the corollary for public entities. For everybody, commercial entities, public entities, and nonprofits, if you are looking to purchase a heavy-duty vehicle or a medium-duty vehicle, the program for that is More EV Truck. That is basically More EV for vehicles from pickup trucks all the way up to cement mixers. There, the amount of the incentive depends on the vehicle class. So you should definitely look at the website for more information. But that, again, is available for all three types of entities, which means if you are a business or a public entity or a nonprofit, you can now stack the state incentive of More EV with the federal tax credit through the commercial vehicle tax credit. And together, those really bring down the upfront costs of some of these vehicles and hopefully make them much more accessible to lots of different entities. Big caveat on this slide is there are different rules for each of these programs about what vehicles and what entities qualify. So for example, For some of these, you might have to have a certain number of vehicles in the fleet or something like that. So definitely check out more info on these slides when we send them out to make sure that they apply to whatever entity you work with. In Rhode Island, we've got nothing. Very unfortunately, we know that there's a need for similar incentives in Rhode Island, but Rhode Island is ahead of Massachusetts in lots of things, but this is definitely an area where the reverse is true. Moving now from vehicles back to charging infrastructure, just like there's a commercial corollary for the incentive to buy vehicles on the federal front, there's also a corollary for charging infrastructure. So just like the charging infrastructure tax credit that Devin was talking about for individuals, there is one for commercial entities instituted by the Inflation Reduction Act. The amount is 30% of the cost, or 6% in the case of a property subject to depreciation, and it's not to exceed $100,000. There's an asterisk here because we are quite honestly still confused on this point. Some resources talk about the 6% as applying at properties subject to depreciation, and then the amount being 30% for all other properties. Other resources talk about it as a 6% base rate for all types of commercial properties, and then jumping up to 30% if certain apprenticeship and prevailing wage requirements are met. We've reached out to all sorts of experts who focus on federal policy and have not gotten a clear answer on this front yet. So we will keep working on that, and we will definitely let you know when we learn more. But as of right now, we are still confused. What is exciting is that this tax credit is also available to tax-exempt entities via direct pay, which is exciting for all the same reasons as I mentioned before. And it also includes bidirectional chargers. So if you want to get in the space of using the batteries in vehicles and fleets to discharge electricity back onto the grid in moments where demand is really high, you can do that, and that kind of technology is covered under this tax credit. And we've got more information at the energy.gov website that we've linked to at the bottom. Just like the tax credit for individuals, there are eligibility requirements for this commercial tax credit, the same requirements for your census tract, and then additional requirements regarding apprenticeship and prevailing wage, the details of which are still TBD. So definitely, if you're interested in this, keep an eye on that website we've linked at the bottom, but we'll definitely have a webinar or write a blog post when we learn more too. Then I'll go through these quickly, but Mass EVIP has yet more sub-programs that help cover the costs of the hardware and installation for charging stations at different locations. Most of them are on a first come, first served basis. One of them is currently closed, but all of these may be reopened with all that funding we talked about in the climate bill that's coming for charging. So we kept them up here even if they're currently closed. So there was a program to help install direct current or DC fast charging stations. The amount that's covered depends on what kind of site we're talking about. But there is still currently a public access charging incentive program that's first come, first served for incentives for the hardware and installation costs of level 1 and level 2 charging at public locations. And all types of entities are eligible for all of these incentives. Then for other types of locations, there are other sub-programs. So for multi-unit dwellings, which are again, places with more than 5 or more units, or educational campuses, there are incentives for level 1 and level 2 charging, and the same is true for workplaces and fleets as long as you have a certain number of employees. So we link to more information for all of this, and again, this is first come, first served right now, but may be replenished with more funding thanks to the $50 million in the Economic Development Bill, which I forgot I had a slide on. So here we go. Just repeat what I just said. There's the $50 million in the Charging Infrastructure Fund that may go to Mass EVIP or that may set up something else. And again, the utility programs approved by the DPU will complement any funding made available from the state. Up to 100% of make-ready costs will be covered. And for all of the segments that we just talked about, again, there's a sliding scale for the actual hardware and installation piece based on how many of the environmental justice criteria the community meets, whatever site is being considered. Rhode Island, again, doesn't have incentives for charging infrastructure. It used to. So back when National Grid was the electric utility in Rhode Island, it had a make-ready program very similar to what National Grid in Massachusetts offers. When the business of National Grid in Rhode Island was purchased by another company called PPL, which is now called Rhode Island Energy in Rhode Island, those programs were fully subscribed and they have not yet proposed new programs, which is something we're working on the advocacy front in Rhode Island. And similarly, the Office of Energy Resources used to run a program called Electrify Rhode Island that was very similar to Mass EVIP in Massachusetts that offered rebates for charging installation, but that program ran out of funding in 2021. We are coming to the end here, so we'll get to your questions shortly. One slide I want to leave you with is there are lots and lots and lots of incentives on the federal level for electrification. And a national nonprofit called the Electrification Coalition has set up a guide, basically, which we've linked to here, where you can check off what kind of entity you represent and what kind of funding you're looking for. And it'll give you a list of various tax credits to pay attention to, the ones that we've talked about today, but also different types of incentive programs that might exist outside of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So it's a great resource if you do represent one of these kinds of entities to just get a sense of what is available and figure out what further research you need to do to see if you're eligible. So again, we'll send out these slides and you can use those resources. We are coming to the end here, so we'll get to questions shortly, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that we are a nonprofit that always welcomes donations. If you learned something from this webinar and are in a position to donate, we would absolutely appreciate that. Your help goes to more programs, more educational programs like this one, and our advocacy work. So thank you in advance for any support you can give. And then lastly, I'll mention that there are lots of webinars coming up that dive into some of these topics that we discussed. So next week, we'll talk about those new charging programs from the electric utilities in more detail. We've got a webinar later in the month about the new models coming out. And you can always learn more on our blog. And if you are a Massachusetts resident who wants to take action on the policy front, today is the last day to submit public comments to the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection on a key regulation around clean cars. So when we send these slides out, you can click on any of these images for more information. But I will now welcome Devin back and dive into the questions that I'm sure we've been getting, and also see if my camera will work. Let's see. Excuse me for a moment. There are lots of questions and I need to get oriented.
I can help. I just thought you were waiting to try to get your video to work because I don't see you yet. So,
oh, I clicked the button and nothing happened. Go for it, Devin.
All right, so I'll answer some of the more intro questions first, and Kelly has helpfully answered some of those in the chat. For those of you who don't know, Kelly is one of our coworkers who has been assisting us today behind the scenes. So one of the first questions we got is, what is a fuel cell vehicle? And just so everybody knows, it is a car that has a fuel cell battery and it's powered by hydrogen fuel instead of electricity. It is just a different way to have a car that doesn't have, you know, bad things coming out of the tailpipe. And then another question, I think this was specific to the federal tax credit and the final assembly location in North America. So what do you mean by North America? That is Canada, the United States, Mexico, and the rest of North America, that Central America bit as well. Someone wanted to confirm if one buys an EV before the battery requirement guidance is issued, then one would be qualified for the full $7,500 tax credit. So you only qualify for that tax credit if you receive the vehicle before that new guidance is issued. So it has to be in your hands. So just keep that in mind. And I know that that can be really difficult and frustrating, especially when most vehicles are on back order, but unfortunately that is just the situation that we are in at the moment. So if you can get your car during that time period, great. If not, you still might have a car that will be applicable for at least half of the tax credit. Or maybe it'll be the full thing depending on the car. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Devin. I'll jump in just to say that in our written resources that we have on the website about the federal tax credit, we link to a page that the IRS set up with frequently asked questions, which is actually a great resource because it gets into some of these questions. For a long time, it was honestly unclear with the federal tax credit whether the relevant date was the date you order the car or the date you take possession of the vehicle. But now in their FAQs, they actually answer that question and lots of other questions like that. So definitely recommend that resource. And we can send that out in the email after this webinar.
Okay. And then just a couple on some of the state incentives. So for both the Rhode Island and the Massachusetts state rebates, you have to buy them you have to be a resident of that state and buy the car from a dealership within that state in order to get it. Now the federal tax credit and the rebate you can use them both, but just know that the federal tax credit again is based on your personal tax liability. And it is not a rebate, so you will receive that after tax time.
I see one question about when the federal tax credit for electric vehicles changes from personal tax liability to point of sale in 2024. Will the income requirements still be in place? And the answer to that is yes. And that is probably the primary reason why the federal government gave itself a year to figure this out, because the order of operations from a consumer standpoint, how this will work is not yet clear. I don't know if you will, I doubt that car dealers will want to be in the business of confirming what your income is before you can purchase a vehicle from them. So it may be that you have to get some sort of a form from the federal government and bring that with you to the dealership, or exactly how that will work, we will hopefully know by January. But the income limit itself will definitely still be in effect.
Anna, this is a question that I'm not sure if someone asked you. I think this is in regards to like the individual funding, but is the charging infrastructure tax credit applicable to electric upgrade needed for the home charging?
So this is an excellent question, and I will definitely encourage you to attend the webinar that we're hosting next week. But that, when you need to upgrade electrical service to install a charging station, that part is usually covered by Make Ready. So when we talk about Make Ready, that is when the electric utility covers the costs of basically bringing electricity to the charging pad wherever you install the actual machine. And historically, Make Ready funds have only been available in public locations, workplaces, and for multi-unit dwellings, so buildings with more than five stations. This is the first time that there will be Make Ready funding available for home installations. So presumably once the electric utilities in Massachusetts actually get their programs out there, if you install charging, you will be able to apply for Make Ready funds if you meet the requirements of those Make Ready programs, and then supplement that with the federal tax credit for the actual charging station. So the details of all those programs are still to be seen. So in a couple months, it'll be much easier for us to answer questions like that because we'll have all the paperwork we need to explain it. But the charging infrastructure tax credit itself is for the hardware and the installation. But the Make Ready funds should cover the other piece.
Okay. Anna, is there anything you want to address? Because I know I've kind of taken over a little bit.
Yes. So there's a question about I don't know when it was asked, unfortunately, but the question was about whether an incentive covers HOAs or condos. The short answer is it depends on which of the many incentive programs you're talking about. The complication with condos and housing associations and things like that is whether they meet the various definitions for what is publicly accessible. So I would say if you live in a condo or a housing association, whatever incentive you were asking about when we send out the slides, click on more info and that should answer your questions. But it depends on the incentive program.
Right. I'm going to switch back to the federal tax credit question for individuals.
Sure.
Just because I feel like this is a good explainer. So this one is under the federal tax credit with a $55,000 cap on MSRP. This again is for sedans. If the MSRP is 60,000, will the credit still apply, but only on the 55,000, and the extra 5,000 will be discarded, or is the entire vehicle disqualified? So that is a really great clarifying question. So it is actually going to be completely disqualified. So the MSRP has to be at or below $55,000 on a sedan in order to qualify for the federal tax credit. And for SUVs, pickups, and vans, it is $80,000. So so just keep that in mind.
Okay, I see a question about Tesla specifically. So somebody asks, I purchased a used Tesla through Tesla, which does not have traditional in-state dealership stores. The used car was sold with a dealer transfer and was done online. Would either Rhode Island or Massachusetts consider the car to have been sold through a dealership in state? So for Massachusetts, the answer is we don't know because they have not yet actually set up the used incentive program. I do know that they are well aware that Tesla and other manufacturers who do direct sales don't have dealerships. So I assume that they will take that into account. I don't immediately know the answer for Rhode Island. Devin, do you?
I don't know, unfortunately. I haven't had any inquiry like that yet.
We will double check for you. The limitation of price is also different in the two states. So in Rhode Island, it's $40,000. In Massachusetts, we don't know what it is yet, but federally, it's $25,000. So that will be an additional complication that we will learn more about, at least in Massachusetts, when they set up the program. There was another question about the federal tax credit and the rules, but I think we've answered it that the relevant date is the date that you take possession of the vehicle, not the date you order, and there won't be any retroactive application of tax credits, unfortunately. Bear with us, there are lots of questions we're going through. There's one question about whether portable electric vehicle chargers are eligible for the tax credit. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, for level 2 charging, which is what we're talking about if you're installing charging at home, for a long time your only option was to buy a physical unit that is hooked up to a 240 volt outlet in your home that has a cord that extends to the vehicle. But increasingly there are portable chargers where you have a cord that you can plug into any 240 volt outlet. You don't have to really install it with just one. And I believe that those are eligible for the tax credit, but we can double check for you because those are a great option, particularly if you travel a lot and want to be able to level 2 charge in more than one home or maybe in a friend's home or something like that. So we can double check for you.
Someone made a really great point, and it says, my friend just leased an EV in Massachusetts, and he said he got the full $7,500 tax credit. Just an FYI, because not many people talk about leased vehicles. So just to give some context there, what that means is if you lease a vehicle, the tax credit is, the personal tax liability is on the organization that you lease the vehicle from, and they can choose whether or not they roll that $7,500 tax credit into the lease price of your vehicle or not. But it is very much up to the individual dealer that you get it from. They, along with the leasing company, decide whether or not they want to do that. So be aware of that, and also just a reminder that you have to lease the car for at least a 36-month period of time, I believe.
I also see, sorry to jump in, I see a question about what is the track record for individuals or institutions receiving these rebates. So on the federal side, everything is a tax credit. So what that means is that at least until any of them become point of sale, when it comes to be tax time, you fill out a form and you get a federal tax credit that way. So that timing is tax season. In Massachusetts, the More EV rebate program gives itself 90 days to mail you a check after you send in your application. We've been running the Drive Green program since 2016, and sometimes More EV has been very prompt, and sometimes it has taken the full 90 days. So it depends, but you should get it within 90 days. And I think in Rhode Island, there's a similar window to wait. Again, this is part of the reason why we're so excited about point of sale rebates, because we know that not everybody can shell out a couple $1,000s and then wait 90 days or a year to get that money back. So in Massachusetts, we were part of a coalition to advocate that the state rebate become or be available point of sale. And we're really glad to see the federal tax credit going in that direction too.
All right. Well, you all asked some really fantastic questions, and we really appreciate it. And if we didn't get to your question, unfortunately, we are at time, but feel free to respond to us in our follow-up email with said questions if you still need answers. We will be more than ready to respond there. But just a big thank you to everybody who attended today. We really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll see you at a future webinar.
Thank you all. Bye.